Welcome to the BeyondX podcast. I'm your host, Mahia Brahimi, and every week I speak to leading industry experts, trailblazers, and market leaders where we discuss the key topics of our time in detail and have a deep dive conversation on areas like sustainability, technology, urban planning and city design, health and fitness, and more. In today's episode of Beyond Sustainability, I spoke with Stephane le Gentil. The first half of our discussion covered the definitions and fundamentals for retrofitting and energy efficiency, the various retrofit financing models, a deep dive on the ESCO and Super ESCO models, and more. In the second half of our discussion, we touched on the impact new technologies like AI and smart buildings can play, as well as a more in-depth look at the potential of district cooling, renewable integration within the built environment, industrial sector specific retrofits and energy efficiency, and demand side management in reaching regional and international decarbonization goals. The different discussion points are all timestamped throughout the episode, so you can freely move around as you see fit. Stephane has nearly 2 decades of executive experience in the field of energy efficiency, the energy transition, and related funding mechanisms, with experiences in both Europe and the Middle East. He is currently the general manager of SOFIAC in France, a fund and Super ESCO that invests in reducing carbon emissions from industrial and commercial clients. He also had a major part to play in the creation of 2 of the largest Super ESCOs in the Middle East, having helped create and personally headed Etihad ESCO in 2013, the Dubai government Super ESCO in charge of retrofitting 30,000 existing buildings to save energy, and more recently advised Abu Dhabi Energy Services Company, the Super ESCO responsible for reducing energy consumption from existing buildings in the Emirates of Abu Dhabi. He has also worked at some of the biggest energy service companies in the world, including Johnson Controls, where he built their European energy services portfolio, Engie, as the head of their energy efficiency activities in the Middle East region, and also served as the CEO of the Clean Energy Business Council in the MENA region. Stephane is also a past chairman of the European Association of Energy Service Companies, ESCO. Stephane, thank you so much for joining the pod. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure with me as well. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
What I'd like to start with really is how you got into sustainability. I know that you had various positions in different sectors in the beginning of your career, but then when you got into sustainability, it really became something you've been doing, I think, for almost 20 years.
Almost, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, going back to 20 years ago. I came to sustainability really a little bit by chance, I would say, because I was at the time I was working in the IT industry. So really in a job where my job was to produce computers. So we're designing and producing computers for a leading brand. And I got a call one day from someone who offered me a job which had absolutely nothing to do with what I was doing, absolutely nothing that I knew. And I was like, oh, I think you're doing a mistake. This is not at all. It looks interesting, but the pitch was no. It's a sector that there are not so many people yet in that sector. Today is very different, but 20 years ago, not so many people knew that sector. So they were saying, we're looking for someone that has quite a broad experience that is ready to learn something new. And that's how things happened. And then when I started discussing with those people, I found the opportunity quite interesting. New challenge, things that were really different from what I've done before. That's how I started. I changed job at the time and started to work for, it was a large US corporation, and I was launching in Europe some activities around sustainability. That's how I started with them. Very small team, yeah.
And what moved you to the Middle East region?
I spent with that company probably, I don't remember, but it was 6 years maybe, and doing a lot of things in Europe. And then similar situation, I was contacted for, in fact, by the electricity company in Dubai, and they were looking for someone to start activities around energy efficiency for the Emirates of Dubai. And they started contacting me. I was not at all ready for this. Did not even knew who they were, because from Europe, I never heard of the company before. I had been to Dubai only once in the past, but as a business trip. So it was a very quick trip, and I had no idea about more than this.
Mhm.
But then, yeah, we started to discuss, and it was a very interesting position, obviously, creating a company to retrofit buildings in Dubai. So the challenge was really interesting. And similarly, I said, well, that's one occasion that will not come again. So let's try. And then, yeah, I accepted. I thought that maybe I would be back to France months after in case it did not please me, or in case they did not like me. And I stayed there almost 9 years. So
Wow.
9 years
It
in
almost
the
sounds like it was your destiny, I think. All the different parts got you into this.
yeah. So what I was meant to do in Dubai was similar to what I have been doing in Europe, a little bit of a different scale, and also with a slightly different organization,
Mhm.
working for an electricity company. Before I was working for the private sector. Yeah, but a nice challenge, and I'm quite happy to have done that. Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think you really joined at the sort of early days of retrofitting in the region. So maybe let's set the stage a little bit about why retrofitting and building energy efficiency matters. Roughly 30 to 40% of energy expenditure comes from commercial and residential buildings in the US and mainland Europe. In the GCC region, buildings actually make up a much larger percentage, obviously less industrial. And obviously, there's also the energy expenditure that the industrial sector has, which we can get into as we go. Um, to put all of this into perspective, what are some of the biggest consumption factors within buildings, both residentially and in commercial office buildings, from your experience?
Yeah, in the Middle East, it's quite simple because given the weather patterns, there is air conditioning, and that's what
Mhm.
consumes the most in the building. Very different. It's very different in Europe, where it's more heating during winter. But in the Middle East, there is no heating. It's mostly air conditioning. In Dubai, particularly, temperatures in summer are such that, yeah, you can't live without AC. And therefore, it's really what consumes electricity, and you keep it all the time on, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And that's what consumes probably around 70% of your electricity for your home. And in commercial buildings, it's probably similar, even maybe a bit more, probably, because you have less consumption from other things. While at home, where you're doing cooking, you're doing a lot of other things. But roughly 70% is what to say. And that's interesting because I remember when I came to Dubai, today we talk about retrofitting, we talk about energy efficiency. When I came to Dubai back, it was 2013, and I was starting to explain to people what I was doing there, and people were saying, but what do you mean by energy efficiency? What is this? And retrofitting, what is this? What are you talking about? And then we spent a lot of time to explain to people, you consume electricity, you can be more efficient, you can consume less by still doing the same things, but using better equipment, better things, and then you will be more efficient. And then people started to understand a little bit, but it was not something common. People were not even just talking about it. People were not understanding what we were talking about. Same for retrofitting. Retrofitting. What do you mean by retrofit? Is like simply the fact that you remove old equipment, you put new equipment that are more efficient. You've been retrofitting the equipment. So, and by doing this, you are saving energy, you're saving carbon emissions indirectly because you're consuming less energy. So the utility will produce less energy and therefore reduce the carbon emissions. That's the main principle. But at that time, it was very new. In the Middle East, nobody really spoke about this.
Mhm. And I think even now, to be honest, I'm glad you gave a definition, because even now, when you go into retrofitting, a lot of times people will not know exactly what it is. People are familiar with, for example, LED bulbs and energy efficient appliances to some degree because the commercial companies are obviously advertising those things.
Mhm.
But I think when you're speaking about HVAC consumption, a lot of times I speak to people and they're like, oh, you need to keep your lights off all the time because it uses so much electricity. But in reality, that's a much, much smaller percentage, right? Especially if you just rebulb to something more energy efficient. It's really the HVAC, the AC units, the heating units in other countries that make up the majority of the electricity consumption. You talked a little bit about retrofits. I think we've defined it well enough now. How does this go about? What are the financing models for retrofits? What are the processes? If you can take us through the sort of life journey of a retrofit project.
Yeah, so there's a big difference between, I would say, consumer retrofitting and then more like retrofitting for larger organizations. For consumers, it's fairly simple. As you mentioned, they can just replace their existing lights by LEDs, looking at when they replace equipment at home, like washing machine, fridge, or whatever, just looking for equipment that are efficient, that have the now you're being helped because there's labels on the equipment, so you're looking for A plus equipment, so you know that you're buying things that are more efficient. For the AC, it depends if it's central AC or if it's individual ACs. If it's individuals, then it's easy, you can buy something that is more efficient. And there may be some programs, I'm not too sure now, but when I was in Abu Dhabi, there was a program, for example, for helping people to buy efficient ACs for their home. It was a subsidy that would allow people to buy a very efficient AC for the price of a less efficient one. For consumer, yeah, it's fairly simple. It's just to think when you replace equipment to buy the most efficient ones, especially equipment that will last for many years. Better try to choose the ones that will consume less, because on the long term you'll gain a lot. Now for commercial buildings or industrials, it's a bit more complex because there are buildings that have a lot of devices that consume energy. They may have a lot of technical equipment in the buildings. There may be systems that already regulate or manage the building. So usually what we tell people is that they should start by doing an audit, a simple energy efficiency audit, so that it's a specialist, an expert that would come and that will look at, that would go through the building very quickly and look at everything that consumes energy. Are the systems working properly? Are they maintained properly? How old are those systems? How efficient they are? And then usually you get a report that gives you a very good snapshot of your property and how it performs today and how it could be improved. And sometimes it's simple things. You don't need necessarily to change everything. Sometimes it's equipment that is not functioning properly or that were not commissioned properly. And sometimes there are some simple measures that it can be done to make those equipment working properly that will save a lot of energy. Then, obviously, if you have a building with very old equipment, usually when it's old, it's inefficient. It's not always the case. We've seen buildings where even if they were built like 5 years ago, you would say they're fairly new and they are still they are very inefficient, simply because the equipment were not in place properly or not chosen properly. But obviously, logically, if your building is very old or starts to be old, you will have old equipment. And old equipment, obviously, they are less efficient than equipment that you would have today. Like an air conditioning system today would be a lot more efficient than an air conditioning that you were buying 10 years ago. So then the question comes how to improve that building and how to replace all those equipments. So there is, in many cases, there is all those equipments have a lifetime. So most of them need anyway to be replaced after years. For example, big chillers that you would have on roofs of buildings, maximum lifetime is like 40 years. So if you have one that is 35 years old, it's probably a very inefficient one that is very costly in maintenance and that you will have to replace somehow in the coming years. And you have a risk that it could fail at any time. So if you have really old equipment, the question comes how to do the retrofits or how to replace them and how to finance that, because in certain cases it's coming at a certain price, especially if you need to change all the equipment. And therefore you have a big investment to make. So some people will make the investments They consider it's part of the life of the building, and they have to, after a while, to reinvest in that building to make it better. Some of the owners of buildings will be in a situation where they have not planned those investments, and they are stuck saying, well, I have to replace the AC typically, and how can I finance that? And that's where you have models of financing that come with energy efficiency, because energy efficiency, when you install new equipment, basically what you start to have, if those equipment generate savings in electricity, in fact, they generate a cash flow compared to what you were paying before. Putting equipment that save, let's say, 30% on your electricity bills means you generate a cash flow of 30% of your bill. So, and you were paying those bills before, so you could think of continuing to pay the bills today. It's just that 30% of it today is a cash flow because it has been saved. So you can invest those 30% to basically repay the equipment. And so you have people that would invest for you and just ask you to give the 30% saving that were generated so that they can repay the investment. So for you, you have not paid anything to replace all the equipment, and someone else is investing, and you just continue to pay what you were paying before, but part of it is being used to repay the investment. So a lot of people would say, yeah, but at the end I gain nothing because I'm still paying the same things. Yes, but you have new equipment, usually with reduced maintenance because it's new. So the maintenance is a lot cheaper. The equipment does not need heavy maintenance like old equipment. Plus, usually you improve the comfort of the occupants of the building. So, because old equipment, sometimes they will fail, then you have an issue, or they have issues that would be solved by new equipment. So you also gain on the comfort of the people in the building. So that's just a way of doing it. There are some other financing schemes where you would also get into a model where you pay only based on the savings that are generated. So if there is no saving, you pay nothing. So that's also an interesting model. But the principle remains the same: is the savings will pay for the investment, but you will only pay if the savings are demonstrated. So that's also an interesting model. Because if there is no saving, you don't pay, and so you are sure that at least the savings should be there. And if they are not there, it's not your problem. It's the problem of the company that installed replaced the equipment.
So that's the EPC and ESCO models, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes. Yeah, and obviously you can also take regular loans. That's all the things. People would take a loan, you can use the money from the loan to replace the equipment.
Right. And I think more and more now there's regulations that are incentivizing this. There's some in the US. There's definitely quite a few different ones in Europe, both at the EU level and the country level, green financing for buildings, basically. So those would be the main financing models, I presume, then, right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, there are other models, but that would not be applicable in the Middle East because most of the models would play with tax. So you have tax reduction if you invest into such projects. So at the end, it's a way to get an incentive for and to finance your project. But this, obviously in the Middle East, right now there is no tax, so it's not a model that would work. And there are some other models where you have also a lot of subsidies. If I take my home country like France, we have a white certificate scheme. So it's a bit complex, but basically it's a system where you have predefined measures that you can do. For example, replacing old incandescent light by LEDs, that would be one measure. And if you do this, you are eligible for white certificate. And then those white certificates, there is a market for them. So you can, when you've done the work, you got the certificates, and then you can sell the certificates on the market. And that gives you an incentive back for your own project. And sometimes those incentives are quite high, not necessarily for lighting, but there are many other measures. In some projects, the white certificate would represent like 40% or 50% of the investment. So that's a major incentive. that helps financing the project. You still have to find a way to finance the rest, but at least half of it is being financed through incentives.
That's very interesting. So essentially urging the private sector to reinvest in these schemes. Is that similar to a carbon offsets model basically, or?
No, it's different. It's similar. It's a similar mechanism, but it's totally different. You also have a carbon offset that exists also. But the white certificate in that case is only for energy efficiency. It's based on the kilowatt hours that you save. That gives you a number of certificates. And then there is a market. In fact, the companies that produce energy have the obligation to buy those certificates. And that's how the market is being organized. So as an end user, you do a project, you generate certificates, and then you can sell them to the electricity providers that have to buy those certificates, and all of them have different propose different prices. So it's like a little bit like a stock market.
Very interesting. That's innovative, I think.
Mm.
You touched on the ESCO model a bit. If you could, obviously, you've had quite a bit of experience with the ESCO model and the Super ESCO model, having set up and worked with two of the biggest Super ESCOs in the region, especially in the UAE. And I think currently you're also working within a Super ESCO. So if you can give us an understanding of what exactly the Super ESCO model is, how it's different from a normal ESCO, and how that can make a difference in the long term compared to a smaller ESCO model.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just to introduce what is an ESCO, maybe not all the people will know what that means because it's a very technical name. So it's the abbreviation for energy service company. So it's a company specialized into providing energy services. Most of them would be focusing on providing services that reduce consumption. So exactly what I described before. The people that would come, make the initial audit, advise you on what could be done, and then replacing the equipment, providing the new equipment, making sure that the equipment works and saves energy. That's typically the work of an ESCO. When I arrived in the UAE, there was maybe one or two ESCOs that were struggling to really find work and jobs. And today, I think, I don't know the latest numbers, but there are maybe 20 or 30 companies doing this, and multiple sectors, including the private sector, which was not existing at all at the time. But then ESCOs, and that's one of the issues, is that it's sometimes difficult for them to work with the public sector, or difficult for them to organize the financing of projects, because an ESCO is not a bank. So an ESCO is not a company that is used to provide financing. So I described before that you can get financing from companies to do a project, but some of those ESCOs don't want to provide financing because it's not their core activity. So usually they would work with other companies. It could be funds that would provide funding for those projects. But also, and that's where you talk about Super ESCO. So Super ESCO is not super because it's better. It's super because I really don't like the name, but it's the way it's being called. But it's a company that is above the ESCO, that is helping the ESCO to execute projects by either simplifying the process, and that's very true, for example, in the public sector, because it's very difficult for an ESCO to work directly with the public sector. They need to be tenders, they need to organize a competition between ESCOs. Sometimes the subject is a little bit complex, so public sector, they don't really know how to deal with that kind of projects. And that's where the Super ESCO can help. It can help to organize projects on behalf of clients and to help ESCOs to get projects. That's one role of the Super ESCO, and the other role is to finance those projects. So the Super ESCO is able to invest into a client portfolio, client building, and then to organize the retrofit through an ESCO. So the Super ESCO will pay the ESCO for the work, and then the Super ESCO will recover the investment through the mechanism I described before, through the savings that are being generated. And that's how it's being created. And usually, initially, Super ESCOs, most of them are for public sector, set up by the public sector, because it's usually known that it's very difficult for individual public sector organization to handle such projects. So it's better for a government to set up such an organization where you put together all the capabilities, the knowledge, the expertise, and that so that in the Super ESCO, and the Super ESCO will organize the projects for different public sector organizations. So that's, in fact, in Dubai, that's what has happened. At that time, the electricity company wanted to had the objective from the government to reduce consumptions in public buildings. And when they looked around what was the best setup to do this, they came across this model, having a Super ESCO. And that's where they decided to create a Super ESCO in Dubai to retrofit the public sector organizations in Dubai. So the Super ESCO is there to organize the project, to finance the project, to stimulate the market. And most of the Super ESCOs today, so you have one in Dubai, there is one in Abu Dhabi, there is one in Saudi, and then after that you have others that are, there's one in India, there are a few of them in Asia, Southeast Asia, there are a few in China, and then in Europe there were a few also that were put in place. But those organizations usually have a life, because when the work is being done, then it's done. So I take the example, there was one that was set up in London by the city of London to retrofit buildings that were part of the city. And this organization has been doing multiple projects, especially with the healthcare industry. Also, all the NHS hospitals in the London area were retrofitted. But when all the projects are done, that's it. So at the end, the organization has been reintegrated into the city organization. And today is doing less of those large projects. So I would say most of those organizations are set up by local governments or federal governments. And then recently you have some new initiatives in the private sector. That's where I'm working on in France. But the first one was set up in Canada, in Quebec, exactly. It's called the SOFIAC. So it is in fact the first Super ESCO dedicated to the private sector. And it's created as a fund with investors and lenders. And the SOFIAC is a fund that will invest into private sector projects to reduce energy consumptions. And currently we are launching under the same model as what has been done in Canada. We are launching SOFIAC in France, and that's what I'm working on right now.
So the cost for this model, the private Super ESCO, the cost would be recouped again with the savings similarly to the government-funded Super ESCOs.
Yeah, the principle is that it's the cost over the long term. And in fact, that's the big difference. Super ESCO is there to invest for the long term. I think in Dubai, we were looking at projects for 7 or 8 years. In Saudi, they are looking for projects of minimum 10 years. In the case of SOFIAC, we're looking at projects for 15 years. So meaning we are investing into projects and I would say, getting our money back through the savings generated over 15 years. So this allows the projects to be going, it allows to do big projects, because usually if you look at private sector clients, they will have very short-term objectives. They want to get their money back within 2 years or 3 years maximum. So if I invest in my factory, it needs to pay back within 3 years maximum. And if it's 3.5, too bad, I'm not doing it. And that's where the SOFIAC is coming. And we're saying, well, in fact, we're looking at projects that will pay back in 15 years. So you can do all the things that you wanted to do that you will not be able to do because it's not part of your investment criteria. And that's where we are unlocking a market that was locked. And if you look at if you look at the challenges that we have to decarbonize the world, it's not by doing 2 years, 3 years payback project that you will succeed. So you need to look at very long-term projects, and that's one step that we're taking with SOFIAC, is to look at long-term investment, taking time to get the money back, so that you can invest into large retrofits that client would not do otherwise.
So in essence, once the life cycle of the project is done, whether it's 7 or 8 years or it's 15 years, then at that point, once the money's been recouped, the savings then go to the end user, right? Whoever the client
Yeah,
is.
yeah. But in the case of SOFIAC, we already, from day one, we are sharing part of the savings with the client. It's not 100% of the savings that will pay back the investment. It's maybe 85%. So the client gets immediately 15% of the savings as a net benefit. But you're right. Normally, it's after everything has been paid back that 100% of the savings go back to the owner. What we want to do in the case of SOFIAC is making sure that the owner has immediately a net benefit. So we are sharing part of it. Plus, there are some other subtleties, things that are being done. For example, in the case of SOFIAC, we transfer the ownership of the equipment. As soon as it is being installed at the client place, we transfer the ownership to the client, and the client therefore becomes the owner of the equipment, and he can amortize the investment. Again, it will maybe not work in the Middle East because it's a tax system, so you can deduct the investment from your tax. So there's a tax gain. That's extremely interesting.
The tax here is coming as well, though. So
yeah. So maybe it will become relevant, but it's very relevant. I would say in most countries where companies are being taxed because they can deduct that from their tax, and therefore there is a gain. So sometimes the tax gain is even much larger than just the savings. When I was saying we share 15% of the savings, maybe sometimes it's smaller than the tax gain that they get. So it could be
interesting. Would they also then be able to double tap into the incentives, like the white certificate you were designing?
Sure. Incentive? Yeah, because the project, in fact, what happens is that we look at the project. Let's say it's equivalent to, I don't know, there is $1 million to be invested. And then we look at all the incentives. Maybe you'll get, let's say, $200,000 of incentives. So then at the end, the investment is only 800,000. So we invest 800,000 and then we get the 200,000 from the white certificate scheme. Yeah, so everything is combined so that you get the maximum benefits. And that's also a role, and that's what we explain to the clients is part of the Super ESCO role to optimize the subsidies. So in some countries, there is no subsidy, so there's not much to do. In some other countries, you can get multiple subsidies from government subsidies, from local subsidies. You have carbon certificates, you have white certificates, you have multiple things that can be done. And to a point where sometimes people are lost in so many subsidies, and it's sometimes very complex to make the request for those subsidies. So it's part of the Super ESCO work also to organize and optimize those subsidies.
Interesting. Do you have specialized accountants for this, or lawyers, or
yeah, in fact, the market is getting organized. So you have people that specialize into subsidies. So we are working with companies that are doing this. But the idea is to be the one-stop shop organization that will help clients to retrofit their buildings. One other thing that I did not mention is that, so it's true also in the public sector, is that it's not the core business of the organization to do retrofits or to save energy. Most organizations, they have a core business. It can be either to serve clients or to serve the citizens in case of a public sector organization for whatever. It could be an hospital, so it's about helping people, their health, etc. But it's not the core business of the hospital to save energy in the hospital. So many organizations don't have the knowledge, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the time to do this. And that's where Super ESCOs help to do all this for the clients. And why they don't go to ESCOs directly is because usually they want to have to organize a tender, they want to compare offers, they want to make sure that the ESCO that they are selecting is the best ESCO. And to do all this, again, you need to spend time, you need to have the expertise. Maybe you need to, if you don't have it, then you would use consultants. So then you would have to pay the consultants. So all this can be done through the Super ESCO. The Super ESCO is there to organize those projects for the clients. So financing, organizing projects, and then bringing expertise. That's the main roles of the Super ESCO.
You mentioned some of the subsidies and incentives that are there financially, especially in Europe and the US more and more now. When that doesn't exist, especially when you're talking about building owners who don't basically use their own buildings, for example, someone who owns a 10-story building that they are renting to subtenants across the board, they aren't paying their own utility bills, at least in the Middle East region. So their renters basically take on that cost, and without any regulations forcing them to do retrofits and to be more energy efficient, they essentially have no incentive to do so. What are those incentives for them? If you were to convince a company that doesn't use their own building but rents it out, what would the incentives be for them?
Yeah, you're touching on a very important point, and that's something that is currently a market gap, I would say, because you're right. The owner would be interested to maybe, he has equipment that is old in the building. He wants to change the equipment and says, okay, I'm going to put the equipment that is very efficient, and maybe I'll use the model where it's the savings that pay for the equipment over some time. But then this owner doesn't pay the electricity, doesn't pay the energy, so it doesn't get the final benefit. And you're right, this is today one of the issues, and that's where the ESCO model is less adapted to buildings and where there is a tenant that pays the energy. Sometimes it's the owner that pays energy, and then we bill the end client or the tenant for it. In that case, it's easier. But if it's the tenant that pays for the electricity, then you need to have a discussion between the tenant and the landlord, and they have to agree. And for the tenant, maybe in some cases, it's good also because they will have better equipment. It will be the comfort will be improved. And so they will make savings, but paying back part of the savings to the landlord, maybe that's a possibility. But there is nothing that is mandatory there. So it's open to a discussion between tenant and landlord. And then if there is no agreement, then it's very difficult for the owner to use that model. Then he will have to use another, I would say, traditional model where he will have to pay for the work. So I've seen cases where you have like a commercial building and only one tenant. In that case, it's easier. Sometimes it's very long-term relations,
Right.
And then it's easier as well because both of them have an interest for this. For example, if you take a hotel that's been there for a very long time, and there's a owner and then a tenant, and they both want to keep the property and improve the property, then usually there are discussions. It's becoming more complicated when it's one landlord and multiple tenants. Then because you need to discuss with all the tenants.
Yeah, especially if it's, for example, a residential building where you have maybe 100 tenants renewing annually, right? So it's very short term and a large number of people.
Yeah. This is still an issue that is not solved today. And I hope that in the future there will be some. In France, we started to see some laws that allow the landlord to invoice 50% of the savings to the tenant, but it's not very used because landlords they are worried that if they start to do this, maybe the tenant will think of moving away.
Right.
So it's still something that needs to be solved somehow legally, I would say, because there is no incentive to do those projects in those cases.
And let's brainstorm here. What would your solutions be, just off the top of your head? Maybe do you think regulations that enforce this kind of thing would be the solution, or maybe some form of financial incentive?
Yeah, in fact, if you use an ESCO model, the advantage of the ESCO model is that you have demonstrated savings. So the ESCO, because they are following and measuring and verifying the savings over the long term, those savings are really identified. So it's easier than if you're working on theoretical savings, because a lot of people say, oh, if you install this, you'll get 30% savings. Oh, okay, but do you guarantee it? Oh, no, it's not guaranteed. But I tell you, it will happen. Yeah. No, an ESCO works on guaranteed results. And that's something that helps, because then if you can demonstrate that the savings have happened, then you can probably enforce somehow that the tenant would pay for those demonstrated savings. Because at the end, he is the one that benefited from it without doing anything. But so you could imagine a system where legally, there would be a mechanism that would allow this to happen, and this would, for the tenant, at the end, it would change nothing, because they pay maybe 1,000 dirhams electricity. Tomorrow they still pay 1,000 dirhams, except that in fact, in reality, they've been saving 300. It's just that the 300, they are being paid back to repay the investment that was made in the property. And in general, they would benefit from a better new equipment, less failure, better comfort.
Wouldn't there be room to have a discussion with the utility providers and the building owners to have something in the middle there? In France, for example, EDF and NG could not subsidize this to some degree, but they would be able to sub-meter it back to the tenants, right? Would that not be something that's possible?
Yeah, you can imagine multiple schemes. The question being always, people would look at their own interests. And today, if you have the owner that occupies the building, the interest is very clear. He pays the electricity bill, so he will save electricity, and saving electricity means saving money. So if you separate, when you have tenant and landlord, you separate the two, and therefore the interests are totally disjoint, and therefore very difficult. So you could imagine schemes where either to make things mandatory, or to ease things, or to somehow align interests. But so far, I think I've not seen anywhere where this has been done yet. But I'm sure it's going to happen, because if you want to decarbonize residential buildings, you'll have to do something. So today, most of the way it's being done is through incentives. Okay, to make sure people do something, governments distribute incentives so that people would act, even if they are a tenant. Maybe they can replace things in their apartment or in their house and get an incentive to do it. But it's not something that is viable over the long term, because if you want to do more, it means more incentives, and for governments, it's more budget. How do you find that budget? That's not easy.
Is there maybe some societal imperatives that can come into play? For example, something that I see more and more with airlines, every time you have a flight, they tell you your carbon footprint for that flight. And so you know how much you're spending. Would there not be, and I mean, with new buildings, there's obviously green modeling, LEED certification, that you know, okay, this building is this level or this level. Maybe there's a point where you can say, okay, we take buildings and we publicize their level of energy efficiency, and it becomes something similar to hotels, where people want to live in eco hotels more than they want to live in.
Yeah, this is happening. And if I take the case of France for residential, so we have, every time you want to sell or rent a new place, you need to produce an energy certificate. That is basically the level of consumption of that place. And this is the very standard things with ABCD, etc. And it goes from A to G, I think. And currently, I think from this year, if you have a place that is rated F or G, as an owner, you are not allowed to rent them anymore.
Right.
So you can only rent them if you improve their efficiency. So this is a way to enforce those very bad properties to be improved.
And I think in about 4 or 5 years, that's going to change to an E, right? Is becoming the minimum.
Yeah.
So it increases over time.
And then, as you said, it's also, so there is this kind of obligation on the owners, but the tenants start to look at those ratings, because they say, oh, if I'm staying in an A building or a B or a C or a D, my bill at the end of the month is going to be different. So it tends to bring the interest to better buildings, even if it's always, in case of real estate, it's always location, price that are the main criteria. But this is an additional thing that is coming, where people start to look at it and say, maybe if there is no price difference, if it's same apartment or two buildings next to each other and one is rated E and the other one is B, maybe I'll go to B because at the end of the month, every month, I make savings on my electricity bills. So.
But that's not currently public information, right? When you maybe if you ask the building, they'll have to tell you, but it's not something you can easily find.
In France, it's publicized for each transaction.
Okay.
If you want to buy a place or if you want to rent a place, you need to have those ratings are provided.
But at the last stage.
No, it's publicized. If you go to a real estate agent and you look at their different properties, it's mandatory to have it as part of the advert. So on the advert, you have the class, etc. Still, it's not the main criteria. People are not looking at this as their main criteria to rent something. But when you have several things they're hesitating, and they will look at this as an additional plus.
I mean, I can only imagine because, and maybe it's about labels are not always the easiest thing for people to understand. So sometimes you need to say, okay, an average person would pay this much or this range in this building, which is an A, versus this building, which is an E, and it's double that amount. Because I know a friend of mine in Dubai used to live in these villas that had solar PVs installed and some energy efficiencies built in. At the very beginning, there were some new, I don't remember the property, but it was some new buildings. So they were paying maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of an average villa in their utilities. And that's a significant amount, right? When you look at the span of whatever 1 or 2 years that you plan on staying in a place, that's if you look at that as a dollar amount and say, okay, you would save this much by living in this building. And if that amount is, for example, 10% of your annual rent, that's a significant decision-making factor, right?
But still, not everybody is getting it. And it's not something that is obvious today, but slowly, I think it's coming.
I think when people aren't getting it, it's either we need to educate them better or we need to make the information more readily available, right? So I think it's maybe a combination of these two. Hopefully people will tune into the podcast and get that information at least for France. Okay, one more thing I want to ask while we're on the subject. So you mentioned the example of London where they went in to retrofit some of the public buildings. They basically did most of the job and now it's gone into the overall government sector. What are the life cycles of these retrofit projects? For example, if you come in now and the building is 20 years old, you do a retrofit and get the most up-to-date or whatever, the most energy efficient products you can get now. When would you then need to retrofit again? Is it that the technology will hopefully increase, so we're not sure yet, maybe in 15 years it should increase significantly? Or is there a linear thing like there is for computer chips, for example, every 2 years there's an upgrade? What's the process there?
Yeah, there is no exact. It's an interesting topic because I've not seen a lot of studies around this. I know this has been done in Germany because also Germany, in the city of Berlin, also they were very early doing retrofits and they were having projects with 10, 15 years duration. And so some of those projects have finished. So they relaunched retrofits on the same properties and they have shown that yes, they can get even more savings after a second retrofit. And that's simply because in most cases it's technology improvement, because there is a lot of focus, especially in the last years, but even now today, all the equipment manufacturers are looking at always improving efficiency of their equipment, of the systems, etc. Because something that is 15 years old compared to today, yes, you will have a gap in efficiency. Not all equipments, not everything, but typically in air conditioning or HVAC equipments, there has been a lot of improvements in efficiency. Yeah, you can do a second retrofit and you will get another 20-30% saving. So after 10, 15 years, for sure.
But that's until now. What about looking to the future? And I mean, maybe this is a good time to segue into the second part.